centered world, a post-hegemonic or non-hegemonic world. And that's a multiplex world. And in a multiplex world, power is increasingly shifting from the West to the rest. We already see a lot of signs of it. The UNDP produced a report, Human Development Report, very famous UNDP product. The Human Development Report 2013 was titled very aptly, The Rise of the South, Human Progress in a Diverse World. And one of the many interesting pieces of information we'll find there is that the combined GDP of China, Brazil, and India, the three leading economies of the developing world, now equals about the combined GDP of the 6 major industrial nations of the West. That means the G7 minus Japan. That includes US, Germany, UK, France, Canada, and Italy. The US government, a little more conservative, its own estimate of world GDP in 2030 says that the United States will still remain number 1, but this is not purchasing power parity. This is conventional current prices measurement. But China and India will be number 2 and number 3 economies by 2030, year 2030. And of course, if you add China and India together, they will overtake the US. Now, if you look at PPP terms, purchasing power parity, and this is an OECD survey released a few years ago, China and India will, between them, produce 46% of the world's GDP. By the way, many of you may or may not know, China was the top economy in the world in the 18th century. China and India, between them, produced close to 45% of the world's GDP. And now the OECD is predicting by 2060, these two countries will produce 46% of the world's GDP, more than the combined GDP of the current OECD members. So they should probably invite China and India to join the OECD. And if you go by PPP, China has already overtaken the United States by some accounts as the largest economy in the world. It's now the second largest, but by some accounts, it's already overtaken the United States. Now, these are profound changes in the world. But what is also more interesting is that the rest of the world, the South, is not totally lagging behind. The South has increased its share of the global output from 1/3 in 1990 to about half now. And this is coming from the UNDP 2013 report, Rise of the South. In 1980, South-South trade was less than 8% of the world merchandise trade. Today, it's over 26%. So South-South trade is increasing relative to North-South trade. South has increased its overall share of world merchandise trade from 25% to nearly half in 2010, 47%. So the world economy is changing in such a way that wasn't possible to imagine a few decades ago. So what about the Caribbean? How is it able to catch up and adjust to these new realities? Again, I speak of ignorance, but I have some observations which I would like to put forward before you in the interest of disruptive but practical thinking. Now, disruptive thinking is not impractical. Otherwise, communism would have been the most important idea of our time. It was very disruptive, but was quite impractical. First idea I have, or first issue I want to develop, is to go beyond this small state mindset and assume the identity of developmental states. After what the UNCTAD Secretary General told me, I'm not going to sort of dismiss vulnerability, what happened in Vanuatu and other places. Small states are vulnerable. But they're not vulnerable in the way they used to be in the 19th century, when we had predatory great powers, or regional powers, and got them over. That's not happening. Iraq taking over Kuwait is not going to happen a lot. Interstate conflict like that has declined, almost disappeared. So a small state can disappear by natural disasters or by internal misgovernance. But sovereignty of a small state is not going to be challenged otherwise by another state, because sovereignty, despite all the challenges it's facing, is still a sacred principle of international relations. But the idea of a developmental state, and I think the UNCTAD Secretary General stole my thunder a little bit, because a couple of the ideas I'm going to talk about are exactly what he has talked about. Developmental state and developmental regionalism that comes with developmental states. But I think it's very timely for Caribbean to consider these ideas. The idea of a developmental state came out of East Asia. You know that. But it is now applied to others. In fact, Mozambique is considered a developmental state. What a developmental state does is to give priority to sustainable economic development rather than rent-seeking. Now, rent-seeking is out. The hallmark of a developmental state is regulation and planning, but also industrial policy, picking industries and promoting it, and partnership with the private sector. Now, this doesn't mean a developmental state gives unlimited license to domestic and foreign corporations to exploit the people. I lived in a small state and a developmental state for 11 years, and that's called Singapore. I ran the biggest think tank in that country for 6 years as a head of research. So I know how a small state and developmental state can give pretty good access to foreign multinationals, but also regulate them so that they don't exploit the people, they adhere to nationally determined standards of wages, labor conditions, and pay their taxes, and not just do rent-seeking, or not just condone rent-seeking by the state. A developmental state puts strong emphasis on technical education, and we heard about this from the minister here, Minister of Trade and Industry, and the Prime Minister's speech as well. A developmental state embraces performance legitimacy rather than simple electoral legitimacy. Legitimacy through performance, growth rates, distribution of wealth, and the like. A developmental state need not be an authoritarian state. Now, this is one of the problems that everybody thinks about a developmental state and say, look at the authoritarian states of East Asia. But that is no longer true. As the case of South Korea, Taiwan, now Indonesia, and the Philippines shows, democracy and development can go hand in hand. Trinidad and Tobago, which has all the makings of a developmental state, is a vibrant democracy. There's no reason why one should be afraid of regulation and strong government because of the fear of a democratic breakdown. And this is an idea that I think Caribbean countries should think very seriously. A very distinguished academic, Tony Payne, has lamented that the idea of developmental state has not been studied very carefully in the Caribbean region, and I was quite surprised to read that. And hence I came up with this point. A second idea is enhancing economic interdependence through production networks and developmental regionalism. Now, we have this obsession, again, with due respect to UNCTAD Secretary General, he has already made the point that I was going to make. Trade is not everything, and trade is changing. So to promote regional integration, we should not be obsessed about trade. Trade is not the only way for a developmental state to promote domestic growth, development, and economic integration. It's a very narrow, old view. Another approach to regional integration, which was also pioneered in East Asia, was production networks. A production network doesn't imply, like say in the Caribbean context, one Caribbean company or company from one Caribbean nation setting up a factory in another Caribbean nation. That's not production network that I know of. It's allowing everybody, including foreign multinationals, to locate the production of a single product in several Caribbean locations. The supply chain, regionalization of production. I will hopefully show you the next slide. Yes. This is a supply chain of the iPhone. And that will tell its story. The iPhone, the most important product. I have one in my pocket. And this is what the iPhone does. This is an example of a supply chain across East Asia and the United States and the world. Now, East Asian regionalism was not pioneered by any bureaucratic organization like the European Commission. In fact, East Asia did not have a trade organization until 1989. The Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation was set up in 1989. But by that time, the region had more than 50% intra-regional trade. A lot of that trade was within corporations, within firms, intra-firm trade. rather than interstate trade. And this was because of the production networks, not only by Japanese companies, although they played a very important role, but also by Western companies, and now Chinese companies. And according to an Asian Development Bank study, over 60.3% of total manufacturing trade in Asia, East Asia, are within production networks. Production networks account for 66% of total manufacturing exports in ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is just becoming a single market in this year. So the East Asian experience shows that international production networks differ from simple hosting of multinationals, and that such networks can gradually lead to involvement of local firms and entrepreneurs, the so-called backward linkages that do happen. And developmental regionalism is another form of cooperation. And I actually have a quotation, and this will make you happy. The Secretary General of UNCTAD, it's a definition from UNCTAD. I hope I brought that, yes. Developmental regionalism is very different from simple trade liberalization. It's about infrastructure. It's much broader than trade liberalization or trade facilitation, and investment, research and development, and also policies that aim at developing regional industrial development, and but especially infrastructure. Infrastructure is a key aspect of what is happening in both South Asia and Southeast Asia today in terms of developmental regionalism. So my point is that instead of focusing on economic interdependence through a single market, a free trade area, I mean, those are important things, but you cannot simply have trade liberalization without production networks and other forms of interdependence. Now, moving on to another related point here, when you talk about regional economic cooperation, we also talk about extra-regional economic cooperation. Extra-regional powers play a very important role, both in economic and security of a region. I was very surprised in the last day and a half not to hear the term China mentioned more than passingly. This is the second largest economy in the world, and by some accounts, the top economy in the world. Here is a report from the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean in 2012. China could displace the European Union as the region's second largest trading partner in the middle of the coming decade. And I'm talking about Latin America and the Caribbean, not just Caribbean. The report also notes that China helped to bolster the region's exports during the financial crisis. And as the report states, I quote, "The region's rapid recovery from the crisis were due to its increasing links with Asia and the Pacific region, and China in particular." So the Caribbean countries, as a larger group, CARIFORUM, have signed a partnership agreement with the European Union. Why not one with China? Why not one with India? Why not participate in some of the institutions China is building? I mean, through the BRICS Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, which is open to any country in the world. 3 European countries, G7 members, have joined, actually 4, France, Germany, Britain, and Italy, despite American objections. So those are changes. Having an agreement with China, there are concerns about Chinese